The PS2 is, as of now, the best-selling video game system of all time. However, it's one of the systems that I see the least amount of people talking about, especially when compared to its rivals, the Dreamcast and the GameCube. So today, I want to take a deep dive into the PlayStation 2 and explore its development, its rise to power in the early 6th generation, and how it became the best-selling console of all time. In the mid to late 90s, Sony was sitting comfortably atop their competition with the PS1, outselling its closest rival, the Nintendo 64, nearly 3-1. However, in the background, Sony had already begun development of their next generation system. Internally referred to as PSX, the development of PS2 began almost immediately after the launch of the first PlayStation. Ken Kutaragi, who was the chief designer of the first PlayStation, led development for PS2, and had its development kept a closely guarded secret to avoid killing the PS1's momentum. The outer design for PS2 was inspired from an unreleased Atari home computer called the Falcon 030 Microbox. The CPU and GPU, called the Emotion Engine and the graphics synthesizer respectively, were developed in-house by Sony, although other outside teams were brought in and tasked with developing chips for the system as well. These outside teams were not told what the chips would be used for, and were ultimately not used for anything. The Emotion Engine provided PS2 with a far more powerful CPU, with it being 9 times more powerful than the PS1's processor. The system RAM also got a bump from 2 MB to 32 MB. The graphics synthesizer was a capable GPU for the time, allowing for up to 1920 by 1080 resolutions. Sony also decided to go with the up-and-coming format of DVDs, supporting both single-layer and dual-layer region-locked discs. The decision to go with DVDs allowed for much more data to fit on a single disc, which almost completely got rid of the need for there to be 2 game discs, which was a growing trend towards the final years of the PS1. Sony was also concerned with making PS2 backwards compatible with PS1, so that current customers would be more likely to return. They were able to accomplish this, which gave PS2 a huge library of games before the system even released. As early as 1997, reports had begun to come out about the speculated PS2. These reports detailed many of the new features that the system sported, including backwards compatibility, a built-in DVD player, and some sort of internet connectivity. As reports would come out, Sony would deny the claims that a successor to the PlayStation was in development, even refusing to state if there was going to be a PlayStation 2. However, fans would not have to wait long to see what Sony had in store for their next generation system. The PS2 was announced on March 2, 1999 and officially unveiled at the Tokyo Game Show a few months later in September. Alongside the unveiling for the system, the event also had demos for the games Gran Turismo 3 and Tekken Tag Tournament, with Tekken later being released as a launch title for the system in North America. The PS2 almost immediately became the talk of gamers, with its sleek black finish and the long string of bizarre ads that followed its unveiling. Sony announced the PS2 before their main rival at the time, Sega, released their latest console, the Dreamcast. This was a major blow to Sega, as when looking at the technical specifications of the two side by side, the Dreamcast looked severely underpowered. This was done by Sony in the hopes that gamers would wait for the PS2 to release, instead of buying the Dreamcast, which would launch earlier than PS2. These hopes would be realized, as although the Dreamcast had a healthy launch, the impending release of PS2 kept many gamers waiting for another year. The PS2 launched on March 4, 2000 in Japan, October 26 in North America, and in late November everywhere else. On launch day in Japan, the PS2 pulled in $250 million, which absolutely shattered the $97 million that the Dreamcast pulled in on its first day. In the first few days after launch, it was incredibly difficult to find PS2s on retail shelves due to manufacturing delays. As a result, eBay became a lucrative place for people that were enthusiastic to get one. However, this came at a much steeper price than a retail store. The North American launch suffered many of the same problems as the Japanese launch. but also threw in a new problem of not much compelling software being released alongside the system. Sega had hoped this would work in the Dreamcast's favor, but ultimately it just left the market in a standstill until more compelling games for the system were released. Initially, the PS2 was successful for many reasons, including the fact that PlayStation was now a household name and the backwards compatibility that it provided for new and previous customers alike. However, one of the more substantial selling points around its launch was the DVD drive. The PS2, on top of using DVD discs for their games, allowed for their customers to use a DVD drive for movie playback, which made up for the lack of games at launch in most people's eyes. This is because many standalone DVD players in the early 2000s cost around $700. Paired with the comparatively cheap price to a DVD player sitting at $299, the PS2 found itself as a lucrative option for movie enthusiasts and families alike. Despite manufacturing delays and software droughts, PS2 would end 2000 strong, selling 6.4 million units across all regions. This greatly impacted Sega, effectively forcing them out of the console marketplace. This was not entirely the PS2's fault, but this isn't the video for that. This was great news for Sony though, as their other rival from the previous generation, Nintendo, would not release their next generation system until the end of 2001. This meant that Sony had the market entirely to themselves, which allowed the PS2 to sell 25 million units by the end of 2001. In November of 2001, both the Xbox and GameCube had been released in North America. While the GameCube struggled to find an audience outside of hardcore Nintendo fans, the Xbox had positioned itself as the PS2's main competitor. The Xbox had a much better launch than the GameCube, due in large part to its killer app, Halo. Analysts at the time predicted that there would be a close race to the top, which is a prediction that has aged like milk. Although both Microsoft and Nintendo had solid launches, as well as plenty for fans to look forward to, the PS2 simply had too large of a sales gap that would forever keep their competitors far behind them. To further cement their victory, Sony secured timed exclusive rights to some of the most anticipated games of the generation, such as Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, and all three of the Grand Theft Auto games that released this generation. These factors, alongside strong developer and consumer preference, forever kept the PS2 ahead of its competitors. But Sony was determined to make sure that they didn't just win, but that they slaughtered anyone who might stand in their way. To meet these ends, Sony reduced the price of the PS2 in May 2002 to $200, the same price as the GameCube and $100 cheaper than the Xbox. To further compete with the Xbox, Sony released their own online service in late 2002, around the same time as Xbox Live's launch. Fans dubbed the service PS2 Network Play. It utilized the HDD slot on the PS2 using a new piece of hardware called the PlayStation Network Adapter. Several first and third-party games supported online play following the accessory's release, most notably EA Online, which was not offered on Xbox Live until 2004. Despite their efforts, PS2 never quite saw the same success that Xbox Live achieved on Xbox. This is likely due to the fact that developers had to host the servers themselves instead of Microsoft hosting them like they did on Xbox Live. Although this kept costs down for Sony, the online interface on PlayStation felt far less connected in comparison to the Xbox's. In 2004, Sony gave a much-needed slimming to the PS2 by removing the HDD slot, which was rarely used. Regardless of the success of their online services, Sony dominated the generation. As the generation came to a close in the end of 2005, PS2 had sold a whopping 101 million units. In comparison, their closest competitor, the Xbox, would end up selling a total of 24 million units after its manufacturing was shut down in 2005. The PS2 had won the generation. But it wasn't over yet. As a new generation started, the PS2 would quietly continue its domination. Just as Sony did with the original PlayStation, the PlayStation 2 would continue to be sold alongside their next generation system, the PS3. However, the PS2 had an advantage that its predecessor didn't, and it was called Wii. The Wii was part of the next generation of systems, however, due to Nintendo's focus on making an amazing experience instead of the most powerful hardware, the Wii was just about as powerful as the PS2. And since many developers were making games for the Wii, as it was the most popular platform of its generation, many developers also decided to port their games to PlayStation 2. This kept owners of the PS2 happy, as well as providing new customers that may not know as much about gaming with a cheap system that still saw first and third-party support well into the PS3's life. Sales for the PS2 steadily crept up as the 7th generation unfolded, slowly breaking records along the way. In February 2013, Sony announced that the PlayStation 2 would be discontinued that year, which led to the underwhelming ending of the reign of PS2, with the system selling 158 million units, making it the best-selling video game console to date. Later in 2013, the PS2 would see its final official game release, a soccer game called Pro Evolution Soccer 2014, which was released on September 19, 2013. The PS2 would continue to see technical support from Sony until 2018, when repairs for the system were discontinued due to dwindling parts. This would officially bring an end to the reign of PS2. The PlayStation 2 was by no means revolutionary. It started the true 6th generation, but at the end of the day, it was just another PlayStation. This is why I think that the PS2 isn't looked back on as much by most people despite its popularity, as it just didn't do much for the industry, unlike other systems of the generation, which pushed the industry into new territories. But I can't lie to you and say that the PS2 doesn't have a special place in my heart. I will always remember the times I would play Spider-Man 2 as a kid and get stuck on the story missions, so I'd just do my own thing. But when I got my first sports game for the PS2 and got absolutely demolished by my little brother. At the end of the day, the PS2 was the first system that I experienced, which is what makes it so special to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.